Welcome, everybody, to our first Cannabis Industry, Wealth, and Health webinar. We said we'd only do this once, and it's true, we will only do this one once. We didn't have plans for anything else, but we are full to the max, 100 people, which is our max, but we'll add more should we decide to have more webinars. If any of you have suggestions for webinars that are specific, whether it's marketing or cultivation and processing or testing, anything on the science, anything on the medical or recreational, or just CBD or just hemp or just cannabis, you'll write me. And that's Jeff, J-E-F-F, the real way, not the G-E-O-F-F, at goodfor, G-O-O-D-F-O-R, .us, not .com. Okay, we'll go for about an hour and 10, an hour and 15 minutes. The last 20, 25 or so minutes will be questions and answers. If you have any questions, and I already do from some of you who sent me emails, you probably can send them in. Here, I'll just turn that on. There are no open questions yet, although I have a bucket full of questions to ask. Okay. First, I'd like to have each person just say who they are, and then we'll start with Dwayne. Well, Dwayne, you'll start, and then we'll go into some detail, your presentation. So Dwayne, introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, my name is Dwayne Zobrist. I run a company called Appalachian Extracts. We are a CBD extraction company. Primary location is in West Virginia, and I'm a member of the Gold Mountain State chapter, which is all of West Virginia, and also a member of some other chapters as well. But my primary chapter is, and I'm also the regional chair for the Mid-America U.S. region as well. So a lot of YPO stuff.
Wow, a real mocker. Terrific. Chris?
Yeah, hi, my name is Chris Dreesen. I am the president of Slang US. We are a leading cannabis CPG company with operations or partnerships in several countries and several states and represent several different brands. And soon to be a YPO member. I got caught up a bit in the in the COVID-19 swirl. So as soon as we start coming out of our quarantine dream here,
with YPO style, they will back charge you for the last year because you were thinking about YPO.
Fair enough. Pay the cost.
Jason, thank you.
Hi, I'm Jason Wild. I am the president of JW Asset Management, which is a fund manager in New York. We do public and private equity, and we've been investing in the cannabis space for about 5 or 6 years. I'm also chairman of a U.S. or actually a North American cannabis operator called TerraSend. TerraSend is in California, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Canada. And I am a YPO Metro member in New York City.
Okay, is that a New York or a New Jersey or a Jersey accent?
New York. Okay. Yeah.
Todd, let's go New York all the way.
Sure. Todd Harrison, I'm the founding partner and the chief investment officer of CB1 Capital Management. CB1 is an investment fund, private and public names. We also have a consulting business where we help companies in the cannabis space find their way. I've been in YPO for about a decade now. I was in Metro New York for a number of years and recently joined Long Island, the Gold chapter, closer to home.
Terrific. And now from my home state, at least where we live now, Jessica.
Hi, thank you, Jeff. My name is Jessica Billingsley. I'm the CEO of Akerna. Akerna is the first cannabis technology company to list on a major U.S. exchange. We are listed on NASDAQ. We are a leading SaaS provider, the leading SaaS provider to the cannabis, hemp, and CBD industries. And our portfolio of companies includes MJ Freeway, which I founded, Trellis, Solo Sciences, and Ample Organics.
Not staying busy, right?
To date, we've tracked more than $18 billion of legal cannabis sales transactions.
18 billion with a B.
With a B.
Tell me when you're at the T level. Okay.
Indeed.
Thank you. Let's start with Dwayne. Dwayne, there's lots of acronyms in the CBD, THC, cannabis industry. Would you run us through what some of the most important are and what they mean?
Yeah, so, one of that's a good question. And is my company, we are only CBD. I'll throw in some of the other acronyms as we come across them because they're all absolutely important to us. When we talk about cannabis, it's important to remember that cannabis is an overriding term that can refer to cannabis. It can refer to the THC, CBD, hemp. So we might be using terms interchangeably here today. When I talk, I will talk primarily about hemp and CBD because that's the space we're in. But perhaps one of the most important acronyms that we can talk about especially in the CBD world is THC, THCA, and total THC. Right now, there's only one thing that distinguishes CBD distinguishes hemp from marijuana, and that's an arbitrary number, 0.3% THC. That's the number that was set by the DEA, or actually set by the U.S. government to distinguish, like I said, arbitrarily hemp from marijuana. Now, it is a controversial number because it is an arbitrary number, but it creates some interesting state-to-state interplay as well. Because right now, states are adopting federal plans that meet the federal regulations, Department of Agriculture regulations, and with the Department of Agriculture and FDA. And there's some debate as to, well, every state's measuring what's hemp and marijuana different. Some states will measure total THC. Some states will measure delta-9 THC. Everyone's moving towards a total, we believe, we know, even though they're arguing. But so that's one number you're going to hear us talk a lot about is THC, delta-9. That, you talk about CBD. Obviously, CBD is the byproduct of, or the extracted product from hemp. That's the cannabidiol. That's what we're after when we grow and extract hemp. You think about FDA, obviously it's Food and Drug Administration in the U.S. That's very important, as they're the ones that are putting out regulatory guidelines, rules. They're the ones that are trying to tell us whether or not we can put CBD in food, not in food, what claims we can make. So as an overriding government or regulatory body, the FDA is very, very important to us. You're seeing a trend. You might hear CBG. CBG is another cannabinoid that's coming. The genetics are around. It's a mother genetic, and so it's new. It has a lot of the same. It can be synthesized into other things, and so lots of different acronyms that you can get caught up in real easy. But like I said, the one that I spend my day worried about as I'm out buying hemp from farmers is total THC. So even though we're looking at CBD, we'll look at CBD content, but we'll also have to look very closely at THC and total THC.
Thank you. Talk with us for a moment about the USDA, and we hear and we see the word organic thrown around, or certified organic. What's the bar for that, and what does it mean to the average consumer or the concerned consumer?
Right. So I will give you my skeptic answer because so to become certified or certified organic as either a processor or as a grower. Well, let me address processor. So we don't farm, and so I will talk about what I need to do to be an organic processor. Is one, I have to come up with my organic plan, and two, I have to have that plan run by a certifying organization that then audits that plan and that program, and then I certify that I'm following that plan. So it is it's as much about knowing how to follow the write and follow a plan as it is about being organic. And so it's a program that in theory certifies that you have followed a plan that meets organic guidelines, that if I'm processing, I'm not introducing in non-organic, non-approved organic processes.
Got it. Thank you. Let's talk about the past, the immediate past, and the current and the next year or two CBD hemp market. We've seen the prices and the quantity change dramatically. Talk with us about that.
Well, if we had a real answer and a real crystal ball, we would all make the right investment choices. Unfortunately, what a lot of people have probably read about is, or heard about is the state that a lot of farmers have found themselves in following the 2019-20 growing season, right? And so you had farmers plant, multiple hundreds, multiple thousands of acres without having a buyer in line before they bought, without having really a good pest management program, without and you're trying to sell futures. And what you saw is a price go from, call it $35 to $40 a pound, or in the hemp world we measure it by percentage points. So call it $2 to $3 a percentage point on the selling price. To I can buy right now, granted it's late, I can buy an adequate pound of hemp to process if I want to for $6 or $7. And so there's a lot of people. Now, remember that $6 or $7 still yields more per acre, probably than a farmer would make doing corn or soybeans. Now, the question is it more than it costs them to produce? I don't know. It's probably pretty close to break even. We'll see that market, I believe, continue to be in flux as the FDA what we'll see the market fluctuate. The FDA will make a forward-facing positive statement one week, and the next week they'll make a statement, the old 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. That happens all the time. So prices really do follow, I think, the fear that goes along with statements that the FDA makes. But it's a really tough market for farmers. It's a tough market to be profitable in right now. And there's a lot of farmers that have a lot of hemp sitting in a lot of warehouses right now.
Great. Well, we're allocating about 7 minutes for each person, and I could listen to you for quite a long time. Dwayne, is there any last thing you want to say before we go on to Jessica?
No, we can get it later. We'll catch it. One question came up that said, can a grower get multiple cuttings of hemp in a season? Typically not. If you're growing indoor, you could, obviously. But once again, there's debate as to whether or not there's enough of a margin to grow a smokable hemp indoors that would be of value, that would be break even or more. So anyway, no, that's good.
Good. Thank you very much, Dwayne. And again, anybody who wants to reach Dwayne or any of our panelists, just go back to the website, which is located at goodfor.us, and you'll see all their contact information, and they won't be hard to get. Well, Jessica is our youngest. She's
I'm not actually.
Yes. Well, you're also our most female.
Definitely the most female.
And you have lots of mosts and firsts. So let's talk about, when did you enter the cannabis market? Why, and what did you bring to it?
So at first, I missed a nice shout out to my chapter in our introductions. I am a member of the YPO Colorado chapter, so I want to make sure that I mention that. I first got involved in the cannabis industry, and now I'm going to sound like a dinosaur after we made jokes about me being young. A little over 11 years ago, I was invited to invest in one of the first licensed operators here in Colorado. I did invest in that operator. At the time, I was running an IT services business, and the operator asked me to choose what software to use to run our business. And any good technologist will tell you that you don't build from scratch if you can retrofit something else and make it work. But we couldn't find anything that really met the needs of a cannabis operation, and that's when we invented seed to sale tracking and what has become the industry standard. And if you go to seedtosale.com, it still redirects to my original company's website.
Is that TO or the number 2?
TO, seed2sale.com. Yeah.
So give us some important numbers about the entire cannabis industry worldwide to the extent you can, and then focus on the United States and perhaps Canada.
Absolutely. I think the most important number, especially for all of us here in a pretty unprecedented time with COVID, is that cannabis, we certainly projected that it would be, but what we are seeing in the data and the numbers is that cannabis is proving to be recession resilient. And cannabis is up across all of our clients in our data set by almost 40% year over year over last year. From when the lockdown began here in the US, at least in our US numbers, what we see is roughly an equal spend from when it started to now, although we've certainly seen some spikes of pantry loading and certain days where we've seen some very significant impact. We had the biggest Wednesday of 2020 so far, the day after stimulus checks were issued, for instance. And maybe one last really fun fact, which I certainly love to see, and I think is really important for all of us as we think about working with our companies and working with the cannabis, the hemp, the CBD, CPG world of the future. In Q1 2020, women...
CPG meaning?
Consumer packaged goods. I think many of us see that that's really the future of cannabis. And what we see in traditional CPG is that women do most of the shopping. And we, for the first time, saw that in cannabis across our data set in Q1 of 2020, where women outspend men. That's a 50% increase over historical purchases for women. And I think it's a really important note for all of us as we think about our marketing, as we think about our products and our branding and the CPG route that we believe cannabis, hemp, and CBD are taking into the future.
Okay, since we're talking about women, what do women typically buy and not buy?
Well, maybe before sharing what they buy and don't buy, you generally don't see women stocking up right before a holiday. I think, selfishly, I'll say, I think we plan better than that. We're going to buy ahead of time. The other thing that we see, we definitely see women buying more manufactured products. And on average, ticket size for women is higher than it is for men.
What about the frequency of store visits or purchases online for women, or by both genders?
So I don't know that offhand. We would probably really look at that on a regionalized basis if we were doing a consult with our business intelligence product for one of our clients. We would look at a specific data set that varies dramatically from region to region, and depends a lot too on what the regulations are in each territory, each market.
What are you seeing when somebody is thinking of purchasing a product, whether it's in a physical bricks and mortar store or online? What catches their eye in terms of safety or the amount of milligrams or fluid ounces or anything, the size of the container, type of container? Are you seeing anything there?
It's an excellent question, and I'm glad you raised it, because we're seeing product safety and transparency are becoming paramount to the continued success of the industry. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the vape issue that captured headlines last fall and the sad loss of life. And it didn't have to happen. The majority of people afflicted with vape-related illnesses purchased unregulated products from the illicit market. And I think as a result of the vaping issue in particular and the national and international attention that it received, consumers are becoming more savvy. And just as consumers have begun to pay attention to beyond THC, beyond CBD, as Dwayne was walking us through, with the implementation of products like our portfolio product Solo Code, which allows the consumer to interact with a package and its contents directly, verifying traceability and anti-counterfeit protection there, more and more consumers will demand that level of information and transparency and pay attention to product sourcing. And I can also tell you anecdotally, in speaking to some of our clients and the folks actually working in dispensaries, I asked if customers are starting to ask about vape products and if they're safe. And what she said is, yes, they're asking. And I tell them, you're buying from a legal and regulated dispensary. What do you think? So they're a little sassy on the front lines, certainly.
We have about another minute left. What would you like to say in terms of the big picture of where cannabis is going or how things are changing in terms of investors or the financial elements?
Well, for the industry as a whole, I would say two things. One, coming out of the shadows and being seen as a legitimate business. That certainly, I don't think was possible 5 years ago, definitely not 10, 11 years ago when I entered into the industry. Being deemed essential everywhere, I think is very important. We are seeing a huge uptick in different fulfillment methods, delivery, online ordering, curbside pickup. And two, access to capital and funding options for businesses. These are the critical things that we're going to need as we enter beyond cannabis and into the future. And certainly as we move forward, and I think the way that we should measure success is through both cannabis legalization, ballot initiatives, and also cannabis businesses gaining their rightful access to a fair tax system.
Thank you, Jessica. Again, talk to you for hours. Let's move to Todd. He's from the South, Alabama, I guess, with a New York accent. Todd, why did you get into the cannabis market?
I don't know who's from Alabama, but it's not me. But I'm from New York, I'll tell you that much. I came in to the cannabis space very much by accident. I've been in finance since 1991, so for about 30 years now. Started at Morgan Stanley, followed that path. I was president of Jim Cramer's hedge fund back in 2001. Was downtown when the planes hit. Saw people holding hands and jumping from the towers, ran from the smoke, all that stuff. Thankfully, I started to see a doctor by the name of Dr. Julie Holland, who is quite renowned in the cannabis space. I saw her after a while. I didn't know what PTSD was at the time, but I knew that I was very anxious and very depressed for some time. And spending, the better part of the decade with her, on a consistent basis and talking through the science, talking about the endocannabinoid system, really, her opening my eyes to really the science behind the cannabinoid profiles in the plant. And it just started me on a journey. We call it, a bit of the rabbit hole for the intellectually curious. I started studying the history of cannabis, the 30,000-year history of cannabis, and how it fell into prohibition. It was really an immigration tool that was meant to stop Mexican immigrants at the border of El Paso. So, the racial discrimination, a lot of the things that have happened over the last, call it 80, 90 years just didn't sit right. And the more I looked at this and I looked through the lens of, the benefits to society, and we could talk a little bit more about that. It just got me real jazzed about the space. I've been studying it for about a decade. I started the CB1 Capital platform in 2017. I'm living in the last decade. So we've been investing in the space across the globe, and waiting for the rest of society to catch up with this fantastic plant.
Okay, let's talk about legalization, the black market, the legal market, the illegal market, the gray market. Talk about that in terms of what are some of the industry catalysts that you're looking for or that investors should consider if they're in a non-legal criminal country, or less so in the United States, or a province, well, not in a province, but in a state in which it's mildly still criminal, but certainly not legal.
Well, the regulatory framework certainly internationally and federally at the U.S. level is created all sorts of potholes and detours for the industry. The way we've looked at the space, for better or for worse, is really, 1.0, cannabis 1.0 was Canadian cultivation, and that's largely played through. The least sexy of the elements, I think, that's the input, right? That's the input product. 2.0, which we're trying to enter now, in our opinion, is US-led CPG, or consumer packaged goods. And that's really the notion that cannabis is an ingredient. As prices of cannabis fall, your input costs will fall. It becomes margin accretive for anything that's using cannabis as an ingredient. That really sits across a wide spectrum, whether that's food, beverage, cosmetics and vanity. There's just a whole plethora of use cases for the cannabinoids found in cannabis. And then ultimately 3.0, which has still been on the horizon, although not entirely on the horizon, is really efficacy-driven solutions or medicine, and that's going to follow a more traditional biotech pathway. So all of this is playing through. In terms of the catalyst, you can say banking reform quite possibly now is coming back into vogue, because evidently COVID-19 is transmitted through cash. So that might be a catalyst for finally getting legislators to move to some sort of banking reform. But really the states, from an inside out US legalization standpoint, from tax revenues to job growth to prison populations to court systems, there's a lot of reasons why this should come through, but ultimately follow the money. We think that's going to be the driver moving forward, as more states and ultimately the federal government needs that tax revenue.
Now, you put out a free newsletter, is that right? And what's it called? It's
a CB1 Cap morning note. We just compile the news around the world and share that, really to help frame the discussion. Got pretty fed up with all of these people going out there and talking about how this is killing people with vapes. As Jessica said, that was really an illicit market dynamic, more so than a legal market framework. But there's a lot of misinformation, from "this is your brain on drugs" to "I learned it from watching you, Dad." We were grown up to really be taught that cannabis was a gateway drug. And what we're finding now, that it is a gateway drug, but it's a gateway to wellness. It's a gateway to your body supplementing the natural cannabinoids that we naturally produce with the cannabinoids found in cannabis. And we need to research that, and we need to frame that so that society can benefit this drug, this medicine.
Do you think the Just Say No people still believe that, or do not believe that our own bodies produce endocannabinoids?
Well, if you go back, if you actually Google Nixon cannabis or Nixon marijuana, he was on tape in the 70s, in the early 70s, talking about burying the data, blaming it on the Jews for some reason. But this is not something, I mean, if you go back and you can actually download at the CB1 Cap website, we do a timeline across history, the 30,000 year timeline. And this, for the better part of history, was used as a wellness supplement across different geographies, across different cultures, always through the lens of health and wellness. So the prohibition, very much the exception rather than the rule. If you look back to the Great Depression and how prohibition was repealed coming out of that, you can almost see the modern day parallels with what's going on now.
Thank you very much. I read your newsletter all the time. Let's go to Chris. Chris, I love so much of what you've done, but talk to us about the individual markets, the lifestyle market, the recreational, the medical, what's changed and where is it all going?
Yeah, I think just kind of building on what Todd said earlier, between cannabis 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, there's going to be a coming split between medical cannabis and true medicine. If you really look at it, a lot of these states kind of tiptoe or countries tiptoe into cannabis under the guise of medical. And while no doubt that it's an amazing plant and has untold benefits for lots of people for lots of different reasons, the real facts are that the vast majority of people walking into even medical dispensaries aren't quote unquote sick. So I think you're going to see true medicine, that biotech pathway that Todd mentioned, kind of take over and become, what we really regard as true medicine. Unfortunately, that's very difficult in our country here in the US because so much of the research either is not available or has been focused on harm. You know, there's a lot of money in prohibition, whether that be privatized prisons, whether that be law enforcement, big alcohol, big tobacco, big pharma, et cetera. So it's a lot of headwinds to legalization, even though it seemingly makes a lot of sense. And as far as lifestyle, you know, that gives consumers a chance to connect with something. They may say, hey, you know, I don't have cancer. I don't have, you know, something wrong with me, but I would like to relax. I would like to be a little less stressed. And so lifestyle cannabis and what generally is deemed in the recreational or adult use market typically is populated with brands, and people, you know, form an affiliation or a loyalty to a brand. And it just gives them some sense of connectivity of how am I engaging with this plant. And again, the vast majority of folks that are engaging with this plant, you know, don't have a true medical need to do so. But that's also not to minimize the folks that do, because certainly it is a wondrous plant with a lot of benefits for some folks that do have some very serious things wrong with them.
Yes. Thank you. What about business models? Let's talk about the different kinds of business models. What's not working so well? What is working well?
You know, it's tough to pin down one thing. It's not like there's one path that this is the way you should go. Business models really are largely dependent on a firm's specific circumstances. You know, what's their opportunity, their capitalization, and like with all companies, you know, what are your people and ability to execute and meet, you know, that opportunity. For us, you know, Slang Worldwide focuses on a pretty capital light business model in that we're primarily in the extracted or infused products industry. So just by way of capitalization, if you look at something like cultivation or retail, much more capital intensive than what we do. Generally, we either partner with somebody in an emerging market and give them the IP know-how, of course, the brand assets to produce our products and then distribute those into their emerging market. We also, the other half of our business, focus on core markets. And for us, that's Colorado and Oregon, where we actually also own those facilities, those licenses. So I'm licensing from my left hand to my businesses in my right hand. Which of course allows for, you know, a higher revenue, a higher margin, but it doesn't always make sense. You know, we're in 10 different states, 5 different countries. The capital that would be required to go and invest in all the infrastructure in all of those places would be pretty staggering. And that's the smallest part of the value chain. You know, cultivation is a long time before you see your money back, and it's fraught with, you know, risk, whether that be from climate or pests or all these different things. And it takes a while, obviously, for the plant to grow and then you to start to see a return on your investment. Retail, of course, is very expensive in that you've got a lot of employees working in those businesses. And, you know, they're making more people every year and less land every year. So property values historically have gone up. So you need a lot of money to be in those two ends of the you know, the cannabis value chain. So for us, we focus on that middle part because it allows us, A, to focus on our core competencies, and B, to invest in things in a capital light manner, which helps to preserve our cash. And obviously cash is king.
Let's talk about brands. I'm in a very competitive, confusing, confounding, cluttered market, CBD. So how important are brands?
Yeah, for us, they're paramount. You know, Slang Worldwide obviously is our publicly traded company on the CSE, but what the real stars of our company are, in addition to our people, are those brands. So we have market leading brands in pretty much every major category in cannabis, the vape category, the edibles category, the concentrate category, and just have developed some strategic partnerships with a brand called Cookies out of California to bring flower, because we've got a really large distribution network. We sell to about 1,100 dispensaries across the United States and the markets we're in. But the reason brands are important for me is a few different things. I often say our best ability is availability. And what that really means is you can't establish brand loyalty, trust, unless you have product on shelves. So that drives awareness. Awareness gives you the opportunity to connect with the consumer in the chance that, hey, they see something, some connectivity to your brand, I'm going to give it a shot. Well, that's your one opportunity to either deliver consistency and experience. And if you deliver on your brand promise, if you're consistently delivering on that brand promise, you start to develop trust. Quality, consistency equals trust. I want to know what I'm going to get when I walk into the store. I want to be able to repeat that experience if it's been positive. Once you've developed trust, that therefore develops loyalty. So loyalty plus availability equals success in our world.
Wow. And you're a new YPOer too.
Real darn close, Jeff. Real close.
Yeah, that's okay. Let's move on to Jason, who is wild, but he's very controlled. You left pharmacy, being a pharmacist. Why?
Sorry about that. I should have been ready to unmute my computer here. So yeah, when I became a pharmacist, I got my license in 1997. About a year before I graduated, I read the Peter Lynch books, One Up on Wall Street and Beating the Street, and it was all invest in what you know, and you should have an edge over all the people on Wall Street that are, you know, that don't come out of pharmacy, that are essentially investing in drug stocks. So I took that whole approach to heart. Started a fund in 1998. I didn't really care what I started with because I felt like I was a good stock picker. So I started the fund with $80,000 in 98. First 12 years, we did all public equities, mostly pharmaceutical companies. In 2010, we started a drug company called Arbor Pharmaceuticals, which grew to be a large drug company today. We've done about 2.8 billion in sales since 2010. And what happened was in 2014, KKR bought a third of Arbor, and so we were sitting with a bunch of cash, and that was when I got a call from a banker up in Canada raising money for a company called Metrum, which was a medical cannabis company up there. I went up to Canada, sort of got bitten by the bug, learned how this truly is medicine in a lot of ways, you know, whether it's over-the-counter medicine or prescription medicine, which is the parallel that I look at to, you know, in terms of medical and rec. Either way, it's medicine, needs to have people making it who have a real focus on quality, which is, you know, sort of fits with my whole pharmaceutical ethos. And we started investing and trying to find as many companies as we could in 2014 and 2015, you know, mostly in Canada.
Why do you think Canada legalized medical and recreation or adult far before all other countries? Well, almost all.
Yeah, I mean, I think Canada, in a lot of ways, is a more liberal version of the U.S. I think if it was up to, you know, the more liberal factions in the U.S. politically, we'd probably be a little further along as well. So, and there's a whole lot of cannabis users in Canada. So it's sort of, a lot of it got forced on them. There was a Supreme Court or a few Supreme Court cases in Canada where people fought the government, said this is my right to have medicine, and the Supreme Court sided with the cannabis growers and users, and that was sort of the catalyst to get that whole program going in the U.S. In Canada.
Now, if somebody is not yet in the investment, they're not involved in any aspect of the cannabis industry, and they have, and you can pick a minimum amount of money or a lot of money, what would you advise them to invest in terms of private companies, not a particular one, or public companies?
Yeah, it depends. I mean, there's always there's a little more safety in public companies because you know they usually have audited financials, and there's information available to everybody if they're willing to look for it in the, you know, public databases. But you know, and you have that liquidity. On the other hand, if you can find good private investments, usually you can get them at better valuations, and you can also have more protections. Being a private investor, there's things like you could invest in preferred stock or a participating preferred, or have what's called a liquidation preference. Lots of things that can protect you, give you better economics on the upside and give you better protection on the downside. But if you're not experienced in doing private deals, or you also don't, you know, you're not that experienced in the cannabis space, I think people might be better off investing in the public side, or you know, some of the even some of the ETFs.
What about European or outside North America in terms of public markets? What's available and what's potentially lucrative?
Outside available, in terms of where they trade, you know, these companies either trade in the U.S. on the NASDAQ or the New York Stock Exchange, as long as they're not touching the plant in the U.S. And then most of the other companies, say the U.S. operators, actually trade in Canada on the most of them do, on the smaller Canadian exchange called the Canadian Stock Exchange, which is the CSE.
What kind of private and public companies are best positioned worldwide, but particularly in the United States, best positioned to scale, to succeed?
I think it's over the last year, there's certainly the market has gone from what I would call a voting machine to a weighing machine. A year and change ago, all investors needed to hear on the public side and the private side were about these projections of how much share these companies were going to have, and it was all about the future. And then that very quickly changed over a year ago, where now the only companies that can essentially get funding or can get it more easily are the ones that can show a clear path that are either profitable. First of all, they at least have some revenues now. Even if they have revenues, the investors want to see profitability or a near-term pathway to profitability. So that's essentially what we're looking for. And the companies that have a pathway to profitability, they don't need to necessarily depend on the public markets the way the companies that, where their business model is all based upon, something in the future that they're going to need to continue to raise a lot of money to get there.
There's, in the cannabis industry, as well as any new emerging industry, there are new news almost every week or certainly every month. What are some of the new news and what type of chance for success might those new companies have? Technologies or products or brands, what have you?
Yeah, I think the company, there's certainly a lot of exciting stuff going on more on the R&D side, what Todd referred to as more the biotech or pharma type companies. I think there's going to be some successes in some of those companies, but it's hard for most investors to be able to speculate on which of those what we call science projects are going to be successful and which ones aren't. I'm more of a basics, down to the basic person in terms of wanting to be in companies that are actually profitable or about to be profitable. And when you look in the U.S., the companies that the place where most of the profits are being made right now are companies that operate in limited market or limited licensed states, which are mostly on the East Coast or at least east of the Mississippi. Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Florida, Illinois, states like that. That's where most of the profits, I believe, are coming from right now, because there's not, you don't just need to qualify in order to be able to get a license. In California, as long as you qualify for a license, you can get one, and that's why there's thousands and thousands of licenses across the whole supply chain there. But on the East Coast, as an example, in New Jersey, where TerraSun, the company I'm the chairman of, just won one of 6 additional licenses. Before that, there were only 6 in the whole state, for a state of 9 million plus people. So that's the way. To me, those are the most interesting companies, are the ones that are operating in limited license states in the U.S., because that's where the real cash flow and profits are, where most of them are happening right now.
Terrific. Now, I see a lot of questions that have come in, particular about extraction methods or whether different types of public companies and ETFs, et cetera, et cetera. But let's throw it open to the entire group, the panel, and we'll start any way you want. But what, if anything, do you disagree with about what any of the other panelists says that's of any substance? Any of you? We'll come back.
No one dares mention.
No one dares.
No.
I disagree with that. Okay, let's talk about the color of the market. Well, it's all green, of course, a green rush. But is it a black market, a gray market, a legal market, an illicit market? What should we call it? And how much longer will it be around and be prosperous?
Yeah, I've been starting about 6 months ago. I started being corrected when I would say the black market. I think supposedly the most political correct term is the illicit market. Whether we call the black market or the illicit market is still super strong relative to the legal market. It's stronger because there's so much less cost relative to it, and less taxes, and you don't have to follow the rules. And I think another part of it also is most of the illicit market is mostly is much more. A lot of the business part of the value chain there is sole proprietorships, and if somebody's watching the shop themselves, then they're going to run their business more effectively than some multi-state operator that's operating in 20 states. I mean, that's just the way business works. So yeah, the illicit market is very strong. Each year, we're trying to move more business from the illicit market to the legal market, and I think we'll continue to see a lot of growth there, especially all the new users that are getting past the stigma and seeing the real true uses for cannabis.
Yeah,
There's certainly.
Go
Sorry,
ahead,
go
Jessica.
ahead,
Ladies first.
There are certainly many, many, many more users who will buy a product that they know what is in it than there were for the illicit market. Although I do think it's an important note to note that right now, cannabis, the illicit market, is already bigger than chocolate, craft beer, and tomatoes. So as we think about that and the actual scale and size of that compared to the portion that is legal today, there's a tremendous amount of global opportunity for this product still.
You're saying all those markets together, the black market is bigger than all of them, or just each one of them?
It's bigger than each one of them.
I understand.
Yeah, but to that end, Jeff, I've seen some estimates that the global cannabis market from a cash crop standpoint is about $300 billion. And if you look at, again, cannabis as an ingredient, right, that 300 billion really extrapolates out across, a whole number of different categories. Again, not just the psychoactive components of it, but a lot of these cannabinoids we're still unpacking. There's hundreds of them that we believe there's hundreds. We don't know, right? But we know that they're really hard to get and they're really expensive to get to extract. So you're going to start to see that, I think, replicated in laboratories, whether that's synthetically, biosynthetically. I think that's also on the horizon. But I do think, my own personal opinion, on a few things that have been said, medical versus recreational, adult use. I've always thought that was a bit of semantics, right? It's adult use or recreational, but a lot of people have been self-medicating for so long as a function of need because of the misnomer and the way cannabis is characterized by society. So a lot of people who would otherwise go to a pharmacy and get cannabis for medication have been self-medicating. So I think that blurs the lines there. The other thing about the illicit market that I'll be careful to name correctly, is I do believe that
Thank you, Todd.
as we migrate over toward 2.0 and the ubiquity of the end products, right? So you start to see more use cases that are away from the flower, away from even beverages, away from even edibles. I think as more of those brands start to evolve and people understand that they can get a safe product that they're not going to die from, and they can get the consistency that they're looking for over time, you'll see a much broader migration. And let's not forget, the government's not done us any favors here. At every step for the last 2 years, it's been a comedy of errors between the delays and a lot of the disappointments, the states, the regulations, the way the FDA has really left the CBD market in limbo. I mean, it's been one thing after another. Global cannabis stocks writ large are down about 90% since January of 2018. So you're talking about a 90% off sale. And granted, if you use the .com parallel, which I often do, right? Everything they said the .com was going to be proved true, but not without a spectacular crash. I think that the same thing is going to prove through here. And we're right now somewhere between 2002, 2003 of that resurgence. Tech stocks fell 78% from their zenith. Cannabis stocks fell about 90%. But as we come through this, you're going to see the Facebooks, Amazons, Netflixes, Googles of the world emerge from this. And I think therein lies the opportunity.
And I just add to that, we're seeing the same parallel too in cannabis that we saw in tech. During post-crash of tech consumption continued to increase. And we're, of course, seeing the same in cannabis, that consumption continues to increase. And as we see those two things diverge, therein lies a tremendous opportunity.
Yeah, yeah. And also the thing I would say, the tech crash, a lot of it was related to the internet, which it was all this big hope back in 2000 when the tech stocks all crashed, but there wasn't nearly the scale of actual business going on in the internet business that there is in the cannabis world. I mean, there is, even if you're conservative and you say it's over $100 billion market, worldwide market right now, it's still so much bigger than what the tech bubble was built on relative to the size of the real businesses that was out there at the time.
Let me talk briefly about money, taxes, legality, open markets, et cetera, in terms of the pandemic, the first of many that'll probably be, or definitely will be here now globally. How much of a driver is that for governments, regionally, state, countrywide, to legalize, open the entire door?
Yeah, I think it's going to be incredibly important for, particularly state governments until the feds get on board. A lot of their tax revenues have been absolutely hammered with everybody having to be, more or less inside or not out going about their daily routine. Nobody's going to feel that, at the government level more impactfully than your state and local governments. And you've got some analogs of the past, for instance, coming out of the Great Depression. There went prohibition because it was a way to be a catalyst to hypercharge those things to get the economy back up and running. And I think that ties into what we were just talking about with the black market too. You've got rampant black market access to products pretty much across the board, but the states that have put in fair taxation into their regulations, that have made it widely available, that haven't tried to cap the products via potency, or you can't do edibles, or you can't do this, or you can't do that. That's how you get rid of the black market. My home state of Texas, they taught, I live in Colorado now and have for many years, but there's this impression, well, we don't want that in our community. Well, newsflash, folks, it's there whether you want it to be or not. So, you're either for a regulated and ideally legalized market, or you're for the illicit market. There is no in between.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm the analyst here. We call Todd the analyst to start, but I'm just full of numbers today. I think Nevada is a great use case for this. Nevada initially did not allow curbside as a delivery method. Of course, the Nevada market relies heavily on tourism and the tax revenue there. And on May, what we had seen was a 56% decline in revenue in Nevada from the start of where we started tracking, we think this is the start of most containment measures for COVID. And on May 1st, the Nevada governor approved curbside as a fulfillment method. And of course, now we've seen that curbside revenue in Nevada is up 30% in 3 days. Money doesn't lie. And that's going to drive a lot more governmental action, I believe.
Let's talk about the bigs. Big alcohol, big agriculture, big food, big. What's likely to happen with the bigs? And are they already in the market?
Well, they're certainly already in the market. If you look at some of the large investments that were placed in the Canadian LPs, primarily from big alcohol. So they understand. I mean, it's no surprise that cannabis companies are taking a slice out of big tobacco, big alcohol, big pharma profits. And there's two things you do. You either fight against it, and if you can't beat that, then you figure out how to get a little piece of it. And I think, a lot of people in cannabis look at it as a threat. And we in particular don't. I personally see it as an opportunity, but I will say that the way a lot of these cannabis businesses are built is not going to mesh well with when you look at this big industry trying to come in. For instance, right now, ourselves or our partners grow, you've got to have an individual licensed cannabis business by state. So if you're growing in northern Maine or a mile off the strip in Vegas in a 20,000 square foot facility, that's not interesting to a large, conglomerate, a AB InBev or a Constellation or whomever. They're looking for market share. They've got the money and the infrastructure to invest to do their own things. And presumably when you're going to see those come in, when did they come in Canada? Well, when you had federal legalization. So when inevitably that day comes into the US, I don't think they're looking for small little regional assets because those are going to largely be irrelevant. You're going to have, production centers via cultivation, likely in the Pacific Northwest, somewhere between San Francisco and Portland, maybe in Middle America and the Southeast, on a very, very large scale, much where you see the agricultural producing communities that we have now for other things. So for us, I don't want to invest very heavily in lots of facilities around the country unless it truly has an ROI and there's a payback in the near term, which is why we focus those efforts in our core markets. That still means, though, that I want to get my brands out and be widely and heavily distributed really around the country and around the world, because that's what drives awareness. And in the end, we believe that those large companies ultimately are looking for market share, IP, and talent. So the more rich you are in those things, the better chance you have to square up with those folks or join them.
Chris, do you believe that there won't be a cottage industry moving forward? Or just that there will be this partnership and then a cottage industry?
Well, I think it'll be a little bit of both, Jessica. I mean, if you look, craft beer, I think is a great analog, right?
Mm.
Lots of people love IPAs. Lots of people, maybe not drink Coors Light or Labatt's or something of that nature. But what's happening largely in the craft beer industry right now? They're being snapped up. That market share that, is being repurchased by the big brewers because, they got caught off guard a little bit. So I think it largely follows that trajectory. But certainly there's always going to be a place for the mom and pop that either brings a higher level of quality or gives somebody the ability to connect with something that maybe comes from a little closer to home. So I don't think it's a black and white issue where it's one or the other, but there's no doubt these companies, once it makes sense for them to, are going to move into this space, and you're either going to have to carve out a niche for yourself and survive, or you're going to get run over, or you're going to get sucked up with them. And, and it largely just depends on what value do they see. And look, it's tough to put all cannabis businesses in a box because there's such a wide variety of whether it's cultivation, retail, processing, distribution, and then untold, myriad of ancillary services there. But I think there certainly will be a cottage industry, but that's by far going to be the much smaller piece of the pie, in my opinion.
Well, I mean,
I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, I agree with you. And certainly that's what kept me up at night 6 years ago, was what happens when we have federal legalization and Oracle and SAP come into the tech space, and am I big enough for them to care? And I'm really actually in some ways glad that we had more time to build, because now we're integrated with Sage. We're partnered with NetSuite, and I have the former CIO of Oracle on my board and a former SAP exec on my management team, and I'm building those strategic relationships for what you're talking about, for in advance of legalization, to make sure that we're not snapped up, that instead we're partnered and affiliated.
And
Yeah, I
Jeff,
think if you would have looked 5 years ago, sorry, Todd, go ahead.
I think we would be remiss if we didn't bring up the election. This is something that we've been looking at for a long time, and I know that Uncle Joe isn't exactly a friend of cannabis, but anybody who knows the space will tell you that decriminalization without a legal framework is just going to drive people to the illicit market. And I think, if that is the outcome, and who knows, I personally don't know if we're going to have an election in November, to be honest with you. I think it's a bigger issue from a socioeconomic standpoint, but nonetheless, this is one of the few issues, possibly the last bipartisan issue there is, with 90% of the constituency supporting medical, 67% of the constituency, 2 out of 3 supporting adult use. So would not be surprised if this, becomes a much louder into the election. I think COVID certainly mutes a lot of the non-COVID issues going forward, but that's certainly something we're looking for. And we have seen companies start to lay the groundwork. I know Canopy, they made a very ill-advised sort of structural decision to get into acreage, which didn't work out for anybody. I think that was an acreage shareholder. They have an agreement with TerraSend, which is Jason's company. And I will, in full disclosure, communicate that TerraSend, is a top 10 position for us. We think that this is one of the companies that is under the radar, but certainly well positioned. And I would say that even if Jason wasn't on the phone, you're starting to see, some of the Canadian guys start to look at, laying the groundwork for the U.S. The U.S. is clearly the prize right now. You can look around the the world. For a long time, people bought Canada thinking that ultimately they would have a global footprint. If you're going to buy Canada on that, we would rather buy US in front of what we think is a matter of when, not if, this rolls out in a broader scale. But the election, I think, is an important variable for any cannabis participant going into 2020 or through 2020.
Who does it benefit? The blues or the reds, and the feds or the states in terms of getting out the vote. If more Democrats or more Republicans come out, or libertarians, what's going to likely happen to legalization across the board in the United States, and comparably that same thing in other countries?
I'll tell you, just from where I'm sitting, it's completely flipped. This was a very blue issue for a long time. And then the Republicans saw the dollar signs and it became a GOP issue. At the same time, the blues turned around and started to champion the social justice causes, which certainly, cannot be denied here. But it's flipped back and forth. But the answer, I think, from my lens, is whoever wants to get elected is going to embrace this before the election. It would be my answer to that.
Yeah, I would say the people win. As somebody mentioned it earlier, outside of maybe ice cream cones and puppy dogs, cannabis is probably the most widely supported bipartisan, topic that's out there. You've got a very vocal minority with some very vested reasons of why to support prohibition. But that support gets eroded by the day, especially as more and more, and look, this is not to be morbid, but the primary demographic that doesn't support cannabis legalization is also the one that generally is passing away every day. So it's the oldest Americans, the oldest Canadians, and likely the oldest, people of any country. And, much like things like gay marriage or some things that to the younger population just are kind of a non-issue, cannabis largely falls into that. So it truly is just a matter of time, but the people win when cannabis wins, in my opinion.
Agreed.
Any other on this subject before we move on? We have just a few more minutes. What about the great equalizers, if you will? How does a new or an existing small company get big? Talking about private companies, what can they do to make a substantial amount of money and perhaps position themselves to be purchased by another, in other words, an exit?
Yeah, I kind of referenced it earlier. You better have something when we were talking about the bigs coming in, whether that's IP that's just revolutionary that nobody else has, that's defensible, whether it's a crazy amount of market share just because so many people are enjoying your products or your services, or you better have some talent in your organization that somebody sees a premium in. For our company, obviously we have market share leading products in a lot of different places, but for us, extraction's a great equalizer. We're not great growers. We have to do that in some places to consolidate our supply chain and keep control of our costs. But for us, I can turn, a $50 pound of outdoor trim in Oregon into something that's worth more than, call it $1,100, depending on what we're turning that into. But that's because extraction allows you, to not, have a lot of capital tied up in your facilities. And two, when you use extraction science to really break apart the constituents of the plant and remix it into something of higher value, that's how we make money.
Let me ask you this question. So much, we all know what the placebo effect is. And if you talk to scientists and botanists, chemists, they say there's really not much difference between indica and sativa. In fact, they're the wrong names, and there is no such thing as a strain except a flu strain, cultivars, it's chemotypes, etc. But how does the public really know what to buy other than the brand name of the product or the brand of the company or the price? How do they perceive, how do they judge its percentage? What metrics are there for them to determine, will this help me? And either it's get high and have a good time or heal my whatever medical malady they may have.
I think there's been a big enlightening with consumers. You see in most of these markets when they're very young in their evolution, where everybody's focused on the THC, how strong is it? but that's akin to when's the last time anybody bought a bottle of Everclear? It's the strongest. I don't think anybody would wager to say that it's the best. So you're just seeing a lot more awareness now around things like terpenes. Most strains these days have been hybridized again and again and again, and been genetically modified to be a heavier yielder, a faster flower cycle, to taste a certain way. So you're just seeing a lot more awareness around terpenes and the way that terpenes in the plant affect you, not only up or down, sideways, etc. But what consumers are looking for is repeatability and experience. To your point, most people don't know what you're getting. It's a bit of a crapshoot when you come in, unless you're really well versed in terpenes, which some are obviously, but the average consumer is not. You don't really know. So you try it, and if it works out for you, it makes you feel a certain way, you develop an expectation that I want to feel that way again. And so for our company, it's repeatability and experience. How can we use SOP? How can we use science to deliver on that brand promise and the way you feel again and again and again? So for us, that's the holy grail.
What about as the price of producing the product, cost of goods, goes lower? What about affordability? Dwayne, for example, you come from West Virginia, not a very wealthy per capita state. How can they afford recreational or medical?
The illicit market. We all in West Virginia, the cannabis has been the cash crop of West Virginia forever, right? And so that's part of we're rolling out a medical program right now. That's part of the fight that's going on, which is how do you assure access to all? And I don't know if what the legislature has done will guarantee that or not, but we'll see. But it's definitely a problem. We have the same problem in in the CBD market as well, is that when there's a huge flux in the price of oil with full spectrum, broad spectrum, or even isolate, it's come down 300 or 400% maybe, and or 70% reduction in price, and you're still seeing retail products selling at the same price, right? So a year ago, I could buy a full spectrum tincture at $80, and there's still a lot of full spectrum tinctures at $80. And so it'll be interesting to see how the price rolls out and how that affects it. But I don't know how you guarantee access, right, that by price, except for the illicit market. I mean, that's the role that the illicit market serves right now.
I think we're also going to see global drivers begin to take place. Certainly we're most of us here are still in the U.S. and we're thinking about it through the closed door model. But as we look at our clients and the quality that they're growing and at the prices that they're growing in markets in Latin America, in markets in Asia, in Africa, we're a long way still from being able to go to the store and buy your African coffee versus your Latin American coffee, and which profile you prefer when in translating that to cannabis. But the foundation is being laid today, and we will see those drivers happen. Although I have a question for you guys. I'm very curious how you think about the hyper local supply chain nature of cannabis in the wake of COVID. And what was really moving toward a global commodity, I think, in the past couple of years. Now, of course, the supply is guaranteed by it being more local, and maybe it will be more than brands local. I'm curious, particularly Jason and Chris, what you think about that.
Jason, you want to take a stab at it? I got
Chris, you go first. I got to think on that one.
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a mixed bag, Jessica. It was great that, we've got partners in all these different states and countries where we're in, so you can depend on them, especially I know I see somebody on the Q&A ask about essential services and does that accelerate the ratification of the Safe Banking Act. So it was great that we were all essential, but it takes a village, right? Somebody's got to be able to buy it. Somebody's got to be able to make it. Somebody's got to be able to grow it. All these different things. So I think there was some benefit to having that, but I'll also tell you, and you know this, that absolutely drives up cost. You know, the fact that we're having to grow indoors in northern Maine or in Las Vegas versus, you know, a 4,200 or 420,000 acre field in southern Oregon, compound that with incredibly draconian taxation with 280E, it squeezes a lot of people. You asked earlier about cottage industries. I think there's always, you know, going to be a subsection of the population that shops at Whole Foods or buys local or wants to do those things, and that's great, right? You know, it's good to have that local input, but at the same time, that's got to be balanced long term with what are the successes of these businesses going to be. And I don't think that, you know, long term success is going to be predicated on having these individual businesses in individual states, because from a supply chain perspective, it's completely inefficient. You know, having to do this, having to have a lab in 10 states and 5 countries versus having 2 or 3 really large labs and owning distribution in those states, it's just not a fair fight. So for me, I think there will always be a place for the market for locally grown or locally produced products. And I think that's very good for those local economies. But I also don't think that long term that's sustainable at scale.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it certainly has helped ensure supply during the whole COVID crisis, because there are so many local operators in practically in every state, because that's the way it needs to be. I think as we look forward towards legalization at some point in the future, obviously there's going to be more centralization of a lot of cultivation and things like that. But I'm not sure that's going to jive with what the reason the states are supportive of cannabis to a large extent is because it creates jobs. And if federal legalization closes up cultivation facilities in all these states and they lose all those jobs, then I'm not sure. There needs to be a balance, because I'm not sure the states are going to be that supportive of that. Which is not really what your question was.
Yeah.
But
No, but that's a very
Well, I think
interesting point.
yeah.
Well, I think you look at Canada. So many people invested in Canada because it was going to be the global output center. We're going to license into Lesotho and into, you know, all these crazy places. Well, turns out Lesotho wants to grow their own weed. Turns out that people become very nationalistic and protectionist of exactly what you just said, Jason, keeping those jobs in place. So for us, you know, I see the biggest opportunity there is as much, again, I hate the analog with alcohol, but it's a good one. You know, they don't brew beer at all these places. Miller Coors doesn't have they don't all own the hops fields, and they don't own a brewery in every state. But there are distributors for their products in every state. So I think it's really finding what that balance is. And look, the most addictive drug in the world is tax revenue. So once the states are able to figure out how they get their piece, and more importantly, the feds are figuring out how to get their piece, I think some of that becomes more apparent. But certainly job creation is a huge driver of that. And if you get rid of, you know, the things that could be done in other places, manufacturing, cultivation, et cetera, certainly it'll affect that. So one of the things that the policymakers will have to accommodate is, okay, if we're all going to grow in the Pacific Northwest somewhere, what happens to the guy in, you know, Pueblo, Colorado that may have a large farm now? And I think that's still to be determined in a lot of ways.
Well, if you look at what New York did with the CBD guidelines that ultimately made it to Cuomo's desk, he never signed it, but it required that all CBD products were manufactured seed to sale within New York State. So it was actually saying the jobs have to stay here. It's got to be sourced here. It's got to be processed here. It's got to be sold here. The entire supply chain had to be in New York. So if that's at all indicative of what cannabis writ large is going to look like when that comes through, it's a bit instructive in terms of Jason's point of wanting to keep those jobs in state.
Yeah, I just don't think that's sustainable. I mean, look, Canopy just backed out of hemp in New York, even with that huge population, and particularly on the cultivation side. Everywhere in this country or in this continent is not the crucible of cannabis. You know, that Emerald Triangle area is a far better place to grow cannabis than the desert somewhere. And that's just dictated by climate. So, I think that's really tough to say that somehow, a grower in, call it North Dakota, is going to compete with somebody in Northern California or Southern Oregon on quality, because that's just goes contrary to the laws of nature. So perhaps with retail and some other things that make sense, but I think by and large, if you had a fully North Dakota made cannabis product, particularly in the flower realm versus a Northern California, Oregon, or some other places, you're getting an inferior product. That's just the facts.
And California is just such a leader. California is such a leader in so many consumer products, not just cannabis, that I think that based upon the combination of the climate there and the fact that, you know, things are just cooler that come out of California than come out of pretty much any other state. I think that upon federal legalization, that would be an obvious place for a lot of the brands and products to come from.
Yeah.
Well,
If they
I'd
can
like
figure
to-
out their taxation and black market enforcement,
That's right.
you know,
Pay some money.
some foils in between.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we've reached the end. There are still individual questions that have been texted in, and let me say to all the people who have unanswered questions or haven't even thought of them, we've published on the What Good For website each of your names and how to reach you, email, phone, et cetera, et cetera. So please, other people who are interested, send your questions to them. They've all been kind enough to donate their time here, and they'll follow up. And if anybody else would like to see more YPO seminars from the Cannabis Industry Wealth and Health Group, please send it to jeff@goodfor.us, not .com, .us. If you'd like to be a panelist, please let us know. We don't know when the next one will be. Perhaps marketing, perhaps processing and cultivation, perhaps something strictly international. Thank you all. Thank you, Jason and Todd and Chris and Jessica and Dwayne. See, Dwayne, I got you last.
Now I'm last. That's where I belong.
No, hardly. Okay. Thank you all. Have a great day.